focusing on Poland, and it would be helpful to have some background on the history of Jews in Poland. And our friend Baba Janazi has prepared some background. Not going to be a whole history lesson, but it's going to give you an insight of probably many things that you didn't know about Poland. So if you could take your seat.
Good evening and welcome. This is the 19th year that we've had a Yom HaShoah program, and it's been led by a very able young man by the name of Saul Congo. The committee had requested that I give some kind of context to the material that I presented to the committee on the history of Poland. So I'm going to try to give you a brief 10-minute lecture on some very important parts of Polish history. I've got a few maps, a couple of great cartoons, and I'll try to explain what I think are four very important parts of Polish history before the Shoah. This is map 1. And one of the points I'd like to really stress is that we have been in Poland as long as there is a Poland. And there has been a Poland for about 1,000 years. That does not mean that all was happy in Poland, hardly, but the fact of the matter is and was, we were there. Poland was formed as a country roughly in the 11th century Common Era. We arrived in Poland roughly around 1060, and we have been there ever since. This particular map, if I get it right, Neil? Yeah. This particular map points out a particular section of Europe at the time of the so-called Great Crusades. A large number of Jews began emigrating out of Western Europe and moved into what would be Central Europe, as well as Eastern Europe. This is roughly where Poland is, or was. Depends on your point of view. The point I made before was, we have had a continuous connection to Poland. That's very different, everybody, from what happened in Spain, what happened in France, and what happened in Great Britain. We have been expelled out of all of those countries at various times in our history. But that is not, in fact, what took place in Poland. In fact, beginning roughly around the 13th century, we were being welcomed into Poland because we may have had the skills that were necessary as far as the Polish leaders were concerned at that particular time. So the great exodus begins roughly around the Crusades, and we, so to speak, settle in Poland. That's the first very important point, a continuous connection to that country. According to the historian Will Durant, there were roughly some 50,000 Jews living in Poland by the early 1500s. That increased so that by the mid-17th century, there were roughly 500,000 Jews living in Poland. Again, considerably different from that which took place in Western Europe. Second, I get it right, Neil? Eddie? Great. Okay. This is the section of Eastern Europe generally called the Pale of Jewish settlement. I like to make the following connection. This is as large as Alaska, Texas, and California. And this is where, in the mid-18th century, there were roughly 700,000 Jews living here. The Pale was created as a result of the partition of Poland by three countries. Poland's closest neighbors, the Austrians, the Germans, and the Russians. By the end of the 18th century, there ceased to be a Poland. It had been partitioned by those three countries. Now, what was it like to live in the Pale? The Pale was a restricted area, period. Jews could live there, but many Jews could not even get into the various major cities of the section called the Pale. It was strictly forbidden for Jews to emigrate to Russia, and we were not considered citizens either of Russia, nor Poland, nor Austria, nor Germany. We were, so to speak, stuck in the middle there, period. This is the way it existed from the very late 18th century until the beginning of the 20th century. It was in the beginning of the 20th century, following World War I, that Poland was recreated again, this time by the League of Nations at the end of the First World War. What's very important about this, as far as I'm concerned, and I hope for you, is that we, in this case, the United States, was the leading proponent of an independent Poland, and that was one of the 14 points that President Wilson had indicated early, in 1919. So, Eddie? This is Poland following World War I. And this is where the majority of the Jews lived in Poland following World War I. So if we're looking at this particular map, it's stuck between Germany and Russia. And I think there's a particularly good adage here to point out to all of you. That is, if you've got a strong Poland, you've got a weak Germany and a weak Russia. And that's exactly what it was like between 1919 and the early 1930s. So this is Poland, independent, again, for the first time in more than 100 years. Eddie? This is probably one of the most interesting photos that I could find. It's a treaty signed by the then Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, Molotov. Behind him, von Ribbentrop, the Foreign Minister of Germany, and Joseph Stalin. They appear to be, as you can see, smiling. They have just signed what appeared to be an impossible treaty. There was no love lost between either Stalin nor Hitler. In fact, Hitler came to power hating Russia and making comments about Russia. And as far as Stalin was concerned, it was a kind of mutual feeling of hatred towards the Germans. And so why did they sign this agreement? Well, in doing my research for class as well as here, it's an interesting sideline. Molotov had been newly selected by Hitler to be the foreign minister, and he replaced a gentleman by the name of Maxim Litvinov. Maxim Litvinov was Jewish, and of all things, a Jew to be the head of the foreign ministry of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. What's even more contradictory is that Stalin fired him shortly before the signing of this particular treaty. I can't prove it. I've been looking for sources on it. Did Hitler have in his mind getting rid of Litvinov because he couldn't make a deal with the Germans about a possibility of a treaty between the two countries? Again, I can't prove it. I think it's a very interesting supposition to make. In any event, Hitler and Stalin signed this pact, And it ultimately, 3 weeks later, leads to the Second World War. Eddie? It's a great cartoon. The cartoonist's name is David Lowe. He was from New Zealand. He came to live in Great Britain, and he was the cartoonist for the Guardian newspaper. What I think is particularly interesting is that both men are stomping on Poland, and I think the rest of that particular cartoon speaks for itself. If you can't read it, the scum of the earth, I believe, the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. Eddie? This is my favorite. I somehow don't believe the cartoon, and I don't know who the cartoonist was, but I somehow can't see Stalin as the wife of Adolf Hitler, but I guess the cartoonist had something in mind. I can't prove that point either. In any event, the two guys, or these two men, these two leaders, do sign this agreement. It leads immediately to World War II. And what I think is particularly important out of all of this is that the territory that Germany took back as a result of the treaty is where roughly 3 million Jews lived. And I think as an end point to my lecture here, those 3 million Jews lived in areas that Hitler had coveted as a return, because there were many Germans living in that same territory as well. And so it was, if you wish, it was a sort of easy thing to reclaim territory that Germany lost at the end of World War I, and if you also want to accept the notion that it was Hitler's grand design to eliminate the Jews, and there they were in the western part of Poland. I think my 10 minutes is up. Sal?
Perfect. Bob has, I think, told us things that many of us do not know about Poland, but it sets the stage for what our program tonight is: preservation and suppression of memory. There are a lot of Jewish memories in Europe, and the first attempt at suppressing these memories came whenever the Nazis moved into an area. That was their aim: suppress the memories, get rid of all the memories of the Jews, except for the museum that they wanted to build in Frankfurt to this extinct people. And so tonight we will talk about how Germany tried to suppress the memories, how the Jews resisted suppression of memories, and a lot of it is quite timely if you read the current newspapers of new laws that are trying to, again, suppress, if not the memory, at least the accuracy of the memories. And so I am going to begin the program with discussion of the paper brigade. The paper brigade, well, Jews are the people of the book, so it makes a lot of sense that their memories are on paper. And we come to Vilna. Vilna was the center, or Vilna, it's called Vilnius now. Vilna in Yiddish was a center of Jewish culture in Eastern Europe. Before World War II, about 28% of Vilna's 193,000 inhabitants were Jews, and many Jewish scholarly and cultural institutions were based in Vilna. Vilna was in the easternmost part of Poland at that time. But although Vilna came under various powers as national borders changed in Europe, and they frequently did change, Jews continued to call the region Lithuania, and Vilna was known as Yerushalayim Dilite, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. On June 22nd, 1941, the Germans attacked Vilna and ordered all of Vilna's Jewish institutions to deliver their holdings of books, art, scholarly writings to the YIVO headquarters, the YIVO headquarters building. That's the place that they had commandeered to sort their loot. And there you see the YIVO Institute, now located in New York. The YIVO Institute for Jewish Research had been founded in Vilna in 1925 to document and study Jewish history and culture, and this was their newly completed headquarters as of 1933. The Germans set up a slave labor team of 40 Jewish scholars to catalog everything under Nazi supervision. Okay, here you see two members of that team working with all the papers that they had amassed and looking through them, and they wanted to, of course, the Nazis had said, it also instituted a quota. 30% of the loot was to be designated for shipment to Germany for their museum to the 16 people. The rest was sent for destruction in the paper mills. Since the YIVO building was outside the ghetto, the scholars had to be escorted on a 20-minute walk to and from the ghetto each day. The guards dubbed them the Paper Brigade, Papier Brigade in Yiddish, because their work was comparatively easy in comparison to the other slave labor. But really, the work of the Paper Brigade was far more dangerous than their guards knew. These scholars were hiding the most important materials by smuggling them into the ghetto to be stashed in underground bunkers, or by concealing them in the nooks and crannies of the YIVO building itself. It meant certain death if they were caught, but the Paper Brigade had faith that the Nazi terror would end and that the hidden treasures would one day be recovered. They would risk their lives to preserve Jewish memories. The Nazis liquidated the ghetto in 1943. Some Jews were sent to work camps, some managed to escape, the rest were murdered. In the following year, on July 13, 1944, Vilna was liberated by the Russians. The Paper Brigade's faith that the hidden treasures would be recovered was about to come through, or so it seemed. The story of recovery centers around four individuals. Avraham Sutzkever, whom some of you may know is a very famous Yiddish poet. He died a few years ago. Shmerke Kaczynski, also a well-known poet who was unfortunately killed in an airplane crash in South America shortly after the war. And Abba Kampfner, and also that was in Vilna, and there was Max Weinreich, in the United States. Schmerke and Sutzkever and Schmerke, that's what everybody called him, were part of the paper brigade, and they were also active in their Vilna partisans, who were under the command of Kampfner. Max Weinreich, he was the founder of YIVO, and he had managed to get to the U.S. just before the war, and was working to recreate YIVO's headquarters in New York. When Sutzkever, Schmerke, and Kampfner returned to Vilna after its liberation, they found that the YIVO building, along with the treasures that they had hidden there, was now a pile of ashes and rubble. You probably can't see it on the slide, but Sutzkever is in the lower left-hand corner, standing in front of the ruins. Okay, so that was gone, but there was still material hidden in the ghettos that could be recovered. As word of the recovery effort spread among the few survivors who were returning to Vilna after its liberation, the apartments of Schmerke and his colleagues soon began to overflow with books and other artifacts. They moved their collection into a large former library building and applied to the Soviet administrators for the required permit to legally establish a Jewish museum. The collection began to overflow the large building and its courtyard, but there was still no permit. Schmerke, an ardent communist, went to Moscow fully confident that Moscow would direct their underlings in Vilna to expedite the permit. The commissar listened politely and assured Schmerke everything will be corrected unless the Jews of Lithuania need to be sacrificed for the good of our overall cause. This was a blow to Schmerke's idealistic views of communism. But an even harsher blow came when he found that the Soviet Trash Commission in Vilna was hauling away the overflow books for destruction. The Nazis destroyed Jewish memories in the paper mills of Vilna. Now the Soviets were doing the same thing. Reluctantly, he accepted the reality that Jewish books and documents in Soviet hands would be at best be suppressed. More likely, they would be destroyed. It was time again for smuggling. Schmerke, Kampfner, and Sutzkever had each amassed caches of documents they deemed particularly valuable. Kampfner and Schmerke had to flee to Poland to avoid imminent arrest in Vilna, so Sutzkever alone had to sneak himself and whatever he could rescue from the collected documents across the Soviet-Polish border. As Soviet influence grew in Poland, Schmerke and Sutzkever moved to Paris, where it was much easier to get most of the rescued material they were carrying back to YIVO in New York. Now, there was still the matter of the collections that the Nazis had shipped to Germany. Weinreich, the head of YIVO in New York now, requested that the contents taken from YIVO's headquarters in Vilna be restituted to YIVO's new headquarters in New York. The State Department approved. The War Department refused the request because the established policy was to return looted property to the last country in which that property existed. That would have been Russia, so the Soviet Union. It took more than 2 years to resolve the issue. On July 1st, 1947, 420 crates of looted books and documents arrived in the U.S. and were temporarily stored at no cost in the Manischewitz warehouse in Jersey City. And here you see YIVO leaders examining the newly arrived treasures in the warehouse. Okay. Fast forward now to a press release from YIVO on October 24th, 2017, a few months ago, in which they announced the discovery of a trove of more than 170,000 pages of lost Jewish material thought to have been destroyed during the Holocaust. These resurfaced documents were among those that Sutzkever could not smuggle out of Vilna when he left more than 70 years ago. They were saved by a Lithuanian librarian, Anantas Upis, who defied Soviet policy and kept them hidden in a church throughout the Soviet era. Remnants of the Jewish culture continue to be found as the paper brigade was sure would happen. 10 of these documents, including the autobiography of Barbara Epstein, no relation to Eddie, he assured me, a fifth grade student in 1933, were on display in a recent exhibit at YIVO in New York City. You can learn more about the exhibit and about Beba's autobiography at our own exhibit at the back of the room after the program.
In February this year, I spent a week in Poland with my senior class from the Solomon Schechter School of Westchester. Tonight, I'm focusing on some of my experiences there that relate to how the memory of Jews and the Holocaust is being preserved and is being forgotten. We visited first the town of Szydłów, which was founded in the 1300s and welcomed in a Jewish population in the 1400s. By the mid-1800s, Jews constituted more than half of the city's population. Today, there are no Jews left in Szydłów. The Nazis deported the entire Jewish community to Treblinka. The Nazis used the 16th century Szydłów synagogue for food and weapons storage. Now, it's a cultural center. You can still see the original masonry arch. And Jewish art and artifacts are displayed there, including an impressive collection of silver yads, Torah pointers, with green marble handles, a rock only found in Poland, and many of which sport the Polish seal, a testament to the Polish patriotism of medieval Polish Jewry. The mayor of Szydłów came to thank us for visiting his city and seeing the Jewish heritage there that his community has been committed to preserving. But the absence of modern-day Jews is palpable in the occasional errors in the exhibit, such as a scroll of Esther incorrectly displayed with 2 silver yads as makeshift handles, as if it were a Torah scroll. Kazimierz, the old Jewish section of Kraków, was the center of Jewish life in Kraków for centuries. It contains ancient marketplaces and courtyards, synagogues and shtibels, and one of the earliest Jewish cemeteries in all of Poland. Today, Kazimierz is becoming a popular destination, and not just for Jews. We saw many signs in Hebrew, or more commonly, in Polish writing stylized to resemble Hebrew. It turns out that today, restaurants specializing in kosher-style food are all the rage. It turns out that today, Poland has a big cultural preoccupation with the Jews, and there are people all over trying to recreate the old Jewish culture. Classes in Jewish studies abound. Who knew? The Nazis sent most of the Jews of Kazimierz to the Belgian death camp. A few were sent instead to the concentration camp at Plaszow, where 1,100 were saved by being assigned to work in Oskar Schindler's factory. But many others at Plaszow were killed by being shot alongside pits that became mass graves. At the end of the war, the Nazis tried to hide what had occurred in Plaszow. They destroyed the camp, dug up the mass graves, burned the bodies to ash, and scattered the ashes. Today, almost no traces of the concentration camp remain. What we saw was a park covered by trees and grass. At the back of the park, we saw 3 memorials. The first and oldest is from the Soviet era. It makes no mention specifically of Jews. Instead, it is universalist. It condemns Nazi atrocities against human beings, sacrificing the Jews of Lithuania for the common good, whatever that meant. Next to it, there is a much more recent memorial built specifically by Jews to acknowledge the Jewishness of the victims as well as those non-Jews who also died there. The third memorial is a little way away, at the site of one of the mass killings of primarily Jews. At this memorial, there are signs explaining what happened there. Jews are mentioned, but not especially emphasized. And above this site, that was once a mass grave for mostly Jews, stands an enormous cross with a barbed wire crown of thorns. One of the things that the concentration camp at Plaszow was infamous for was its commander, Amnon Gut. Gut had a rifle and would play target practice each day by shooting inmates at the camp, in the camp from the back balcony of his house next door. For many, many years after the war, that house stood empty and derelict. Nobody would buy it. Imagine the ghosts that must haunt such a place. Recently, though, someone finally bought the house and fixed it up and is living there. Naturally, the new owner does not want visitors or signs on his property. At Krakow's Galicia Jewish Museum, we saw a photography exhibit entitled Traces of Memory. At this exhibit, there are pictures of synagogues that stand intact and empty, synagogues that have been turned into libraries or museums, and synagogues that have been turned into shopping malls. There are pictures of the remains of Jewish life in Poland, such as Jewish symbols on buildings that are no longer Jewish, and also pictures of Jewish life reborn in Poland, such as new JCCs and Chabad houses, and visitors such as March of the Living returning to Poland to remember the Holocaust. We learned that the photographer had traveled throughout the countryside asking about any Jewish artifacts in the area in order to find these little traces of memory, these little remnants of Jewish history that are now overgrown and run down. One time he met a farmer who told him of a Jewish stone he had as a doorstep. It was a tombstone. During the war, so many Jewish cemeteries were desecrated that tombstones became readily available scrap material for building. And there were no Jews left to protest. But after witnessing the reverence with which the photographer treated the tombstone, the farmer was so moved that he ceased using it as his doorstop and replaced it with a new stone. Jewish shtetl life once thrived in the town of Tikocin, in modern parlance, or in Yiddish, Tiktik. We prayed at a medieval synagogue there, with murals of the prayers on the wall. This may have been the first time those walls have heard the sounds of Jewish prayer in years. In 1941, Nazi Einsatzgruppen marched the entire Jewish population into the nearby Wukohovo forest and shot them all. The mass graves still lie in a clearing there, now accompanied by a memorial marker. This site has been known for a long time, but it is merely one of countless similar sites scattered throughout Eastern Europe, most of which went unmarked and unremembered for years. Many of these sites have now been identified and marked, thanks to one man who has made this his life's work. Mom?
And Louie is still ill and couldn't be with us tonight, so I'm going to read what she wrote. You are here. I'm so glad you could come. Nevertheless, I'm going to read your speech for you. Father Patrick des Bois. Born in 1955, Father Patrick des Bois is a French Catholic priest deeply involved in Jewish issues. His interest in the Holocaust began at a young age because his grandfather was a French soldier deported to the Nazi prison in Ramaruska, Ukraine during the war. Although his grandfather said little about it, Father des Bois wanted to learn more about the Holocaust's Jewish victims in Ramaruska and beyond. In 2002, des Bois visited Ukraine to see where his grandfather was imprisoned and to stand as a marker to those who had perished. He was shocked to discover that there existed not a single marker for the 1.25 million Jewish victims in all of Ukraine and Belarus. At Ramaruska, the mayor brushed him off when he asked to see the site, saying no one knew anything about it. He returned 4 times. Finally, a new mayor led him to the forest where 50 elderly men and women were gathered. You are standing on the graves of the last 1,500 Jews of Ramaruska, the mayor said. One by one, the villagers told how the Jews were marched out to this clearing, forced to dig deep pits and hand over their valuables before being shot. The Germans had forced them, children or teenagers at the time, to guard the Jews and then cover the corpse-filled pits. The photo shows Father des Bois with his first witness. One woman tearfully told him, "I was at my farm. I was 14, and they told me, 'Come, come.' And I had to climb in the trees and pick up pieces of corpses and hide them with branches in the grave so that the next Jews will not see them." They told des Bois they had never before publicly spoken of what had happened. Many asked the priest before he left, "Why are you coming so late? We have been waiting for you." In order to right this wrong, des Bois helped found Yachad in Unum. The organization is dedicated to locating the sites of all the mass graves of Jewish and Roma victims of the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi mobile killing units, in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc. It must be noted that the SS recruited collaborationist local police in this enterprise. Des Bois and his team interview witnesses of the mass shootings, which took place next to their homes, and the mass graves are located. The photo shows 2 women pointing to a mass grave. Des Bois estimates that in Eastern Europe there are well over 1.5 million Jewish victims buried in some 2,000 mass graves. They have identified over 600 to date. In 2016, des Bois became the inaugural professor of the practice of the forensic study of the Holocaust at Georgetown University.
were murdered by the Nazis for hiding Jews highlights the complexity of Polish-Jewish relations. For a few, it is a symbol of Polish sacrifice and the joint fate of Poles and Jews under German occupation. For others, it illustrates Polish betrayal of their Jewish neighbors and the bloody end of 1,000 years of joint Polish-Jewish life. The Ulmer Family Museum, which honors Poles who protected Jews during World War II, opened in 2016 in a state ceremony attended by Polish President Andrzej Duda in the Polish village of Markowa, where the family was executed 72 years ago, Alongside the historic exhibits documenting the dramatic and heart-rending story, the museum includes a monument commemorating the Jews who were murdered in the region and another for Poles who paid with their lives to save the Jews. The Ulmer family's lives were cut short at the end of March 1944. About 18 months earlier, they had opened their doors to aid Jews from adjacent villages who had fled the Nazis. When the Germans discovered them all, they shot the Jews to death. Then they murdered Josef Ulmer and his wife, Victoria, who was 7 months pregnant, as well as their 6 young children. The murder shook the entire area and caused concern among other Polish farmers who hid Jews and began to fear for their lives. The morning after, 24 corpses of Jews were discovered in the fields. They had been murdered by the very peasants who had given them refuge for 20 months. Yad Vashem has recognized 6,620 Poles as righteous among the nations. The number of people saving Jews is relatively high compared to other nations. Many Poles use this claim as an attempt to clear the Poles of complicity in the murder of Jews during the Holocaust. True, the Poles constitute the largest group in the righteous among the nations, but you have to remember that the number is not high if you take into account that there were 3 million Jews in Poland, says Irina Steinfeld, director of Yad Vashem's Righteous Among the Nations department. The number of righteous people does not attest to the character of a people, but rather to the character of those individuals. The Institute of National Remembrance documents some 1,500 Poles who were persecuted by the Germans on suspicion of helping Jews. There is no definitive answer as to how many paid with their lives. The other side of the story, Poles who abetted the Nazis in murdering Jews, is not found in the museum. Polish historian Professor Jan Brokowski, whose 2013 book, Hunt for the Jews, described the dark side of Polish behavior during the Holocaust, says that the Polish state institutions have recently gone into overdrive in an attempt to prove the extent of the helping hand phenomenon. He adds, if you believe the statements of Polish diplomats, officials, and large growing segments of the Polish public, helping the Jews was one of the major preoccupations of Polish society under the German occupation. The claim is, of course, ridiculous, but it is very popular in Poland and it unites people from the extreme right to the left of the political spectrum. He turns the spotlight on the Ulmer's neighbors, who collaborated with the Nazis. How did the Germans learn about the Ulmers? Who turned them into the occupier and why? More importantly, what was the reaction of the local community to the unfolding tragedy? Grabowski belongs to Poland's new historians, whose research puts a not-so-flattering mirror before Polish eyes to the disgruntlement of the conservative right-wing government. His colleague, Professor Jan Tomasz Gross, another Pole, shocked Poland 15 years ago when he revealed the murder that Poles committed against their Jewish neighbors in another town, Jedwabne. These days, in line with the new winds blowing from Warsaw, he is persona non grata in his homeland. If we want to be credible claiming our heroes from the past, we must acknowledge our villains as well, he says. Yad Vashem Steinfeld also criticizes the Polish attempt to exaggerate the number of Poles who saved Jews. It is still a minority, she says. It angers me that Poles sometimes argue that the general attitude towards saving, Poles sometimes argue that the general attitude leaned towards saving Jews. Steinfeld says the Ulmer family was probably afraid not only of the Germans, but also of some of their Polish neighbors. There were informers and betrayers and even Poles who murdered other Poles for hiding Jews, she explains. There are survivors who told us that after the liberation, the Pole who had saved them told them to leave their hiding place at night without telling the neighbors who exactly had saved them. Clearly, saving Jews did not score the savior any points in Polish society. History is not black and white. It is good to tell the story of the Ulmer family, but it wouldn't be right to present it as an example of how all Poles behaved. Sebastian Rejak, the Polish Foreign Ministry envoy to the Jewish diaspora, told reporters recently, "All kinds of human behavior emerge here," notes Steinfeld. Poles who saved displaying great heroism, Poles who saved in order to extort money from Jews, and some Poles who murdered Jews. We need to recognize the few who risked their own lives, but we must not exonerate an entire nation.
Poland Museum, located in Warsaw, Poland, is the first public-private partnership in Poland. It's created jointly by the government, the local government, and a non-governmental organization. It's a modern cultural institution, a narrative museum, which presents a 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. Its mission, quote, "Serving the ideas of openness, tolerance, and truth, the Poland Museum contributes to mutual understanding and respect among Poles and Jews," unquote. This museum created sharp discussion even before it opened its doors in 2014. The narrative has been described as being clearly marked by the theme of Polish-Jewish rivalry over who suffered the most. Overall, many conservative journalists who viewed the museum were relieved that Poland's good name had been preserved and that in the main, Poland was shown to have been a historically safe haven for the Jews. Left-wing critics were upset over the extensive use of an idealized message throughout the museum. Too much emphasis, they claimed, on Poland's attitude of tolerance and even generosity in taking in Jewish refugees who returned the favor by boosting Poland's well-being and prosperity. Two examples illustrate the difficulty of assessing the quality of the museum's presentation. There are stories about racial segregation against Jews due to nationalist militias and antagonism of the late 1930s, quote, "but they are handled without cheap dramatics," unquote, wrote one columnist. There's also the claim that the horror of Poles who betrayed Jews in hiding to the Germans for money was touched on in a, quote, "unbiased way," as was the Jedwabne pogrom of 1941. A short description states that Poles did perpetrate the crimes, but were encouraged to do so by the Germans in the towns. The issues were presented without making accusations. In sum, for the Polish right, this presentation is satisfactory. For the Polish left, it's certainly not enough mea culpa. Who's right? Perhaps, like so many other questions, there is some truth on both sides. It's hard, if not impossible, to debate solid facts, but it is much easier, almost natural, to debate memory, perception, and emotion.
At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the camps have been well preserved and include a museum teaching visitors about the Holocaust. Poland wants to make sure that the Holocaust is remembered as a Nazi atrocity, not a Polish one. So it prefers that we refer to the concentration camp itself by its German name, Auschwitz, rather than by the Polish name of the town by which it was built, Auschwitz. The same is true for other Nazi concentration camps in Poland. Poles want everyone to be forever clear on the fact that these concentration camps were built and operated by the German Nazis in Nazi-occupied Poland, not by the Polish government. One powerful moment for me there was when we prayed Mincha at the very spot where the train tracks entered the camp. At Plaszow, the Nazis tried to remove all traces of the Belgians' extermination camp, and even planted grass over the site. But they could not hide their crimes, and in 2004, a large memorial opened there covering the entire site. Here's what it looks like when it's not covered with snow. The monument was designed by 3 Polish artists. As you can see, the signs are quite explicit that the purpose of the camp was to kill Jews. Unlike at Auschwitz, at Belgium the Nazis did not record the names of the people they killed. Many, many of those names are still unknown to the world. The names on the wall of the memorial are only symbolic and representative. The most common first names and family names from Jewish families in the area. This is the best that memory can achieve. According to the testimony of survivors, the road into the extermination camp at Majdanek, the road that Jews were made to walk to the camp, was paved with Jewish tombstones. Based on this testimony, people have now excavated those very tombstones and confirmed the story. I was able to see them myself, peering down through the cracks at the edges through a frost-covered grid in the road. This picture, of course, is from summer when there's no frost covering the windows. The tombstones had been covered up until recently, but the Nazis did not have the time to completely destroy and hide the camp due to the rapid advance of Soviet troops at the end of the war. In fact, I have since learned that after the war, the Soviet secret police used the barracks there to house Polish political prisoners who were awaiting shipment to the gulags in the Soviet Union. In the Warsaw Ghetto, the buildings were made of stone. In Warsaw itself, as well as in the ghetto, the buildings were made of stone, and therefore one could not easily nail a mezuzah to a doorpost. Instead, the buildings were made with little niches by the doors. The parchment for the mezuzah was put inside the niche, and the niche was covered with a wood panel. For instance, this house stood right next to the Alta Schule in Warsaw and was in fact the place where, the Alta Schule in Krakow, it was in many places, and this spot was where the rabbi lived for that shul. Some of these old buildings, such as this one, still remain, in fact, and one can see these niches, no longer with parchment or wood panel covering it. But each year, a few more buildings get renovated or replaced, and these old niches are gradually disappearing from the city. This building, it's a bank nowadays, and it has 2 doors. Last year, we were told, one could still see these niches on both doors, but one wing of the building has since been renovated, and now one can only see a niche by one of the doors, or this door. How many more years will it be until that niche is gone too? While we were at in Warszawa, we went to a local public school for a dialogue with Polish Catholic high school students, an annual tradition for Checker students. The next day, we heard an incredible story. Recently, a local man with an older home was repairing his roof when he found a cloth, a piece of a Torah parchment, being used as ceiling insulation. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it didn't belong there, so he prepared to throw it out, together with several more pieces he had found as well. Fortunately, his daughter, a student at the very school we visited, saw what he'd found in the roof and asked him not to discard it. She related that she participated in a dialogue with Jewish students from New York, and that this insulation was likely from a Torah, and that she would instead bring it to school to her teacher for Jewish studies. There are no Jews left in the city, but the local school and community keep the Jewish memory of the town alive. Our teacher, Rabbi Powell, was shown the largest piece, while the remainder of the parchment scraps had already been sent to Israel for burial.
At this point, I would like to welcome a special guest, Anna Silverman, who will tell us about her Polish ancestry.
I'd like to thank you very much for your relation from Poland, because I was walking around Kazimierz a few years ago and saw many of those niches, some of them patched already and unique, but I remember seeing them and crying, just knowing that there no one was in there. It's a very sad story of my country. I would like to share with you my story, a story of many Jews like me, many of them still not knowing that they are Jewish. In the 1990s, after the fall of communism, it became more respectable, even fashionable to be Jewish in Poland. Since then, many Poles have discovered they have Jewish ancestry. If you go to any synagogue in Poland, there are only 3 in Warsaw, a few in Krakow, Wrocław, Poland, and Gdańsk, Poznań and Gdańsk. You will find people who come there to learn about Jewish culture. Then they find out that they have Jewish relatives. Then they convert to Judaism. There are also people who discover that they were taken from Jewish parents as babies and adopted by non-Jewish families. I have an acquaintance whose mother made a deathbed confession to him that she was not his birth mother. He was 65 years of age when he learned about it. I myself found out I was Jewish by overhearing my mother telling my cousins that they were not Jewish, but I was. It just slipped out of her mouth. I was 25 at the time. I had always known that my mother's father was Jewish, so I assumed I was 1/4 Jewish. My grandfather was openly Jewish, which was rare in those days. My mother had told me that Granny was not Jewish. Now I had finally learned the truth. Both of my mother's parents were Jewish, which meant that she was Jewish, and so was I. My father never knew my mother was Jewish. And even after I found out, I didn't tell him. Somehow I knew that these sorts of things should be kept secret. At first, I didn't know what to do with the knowledge that I was Jewish. Years later, I joined a Jewish choir that sang Jewish music, and in 2010 I started to attend synagogue, learn to lead services, and learn more about Judaism. I also terminated my membership in the Catholic Church and reconverted to Judaism. In the end, it was a relief to find out I was Jewish. I never felt I was quite in my own skin until I learned that I was fully Jewish. I cannot not be Jewish. I couldn't even feel fully Polish until I learned my full history, that I was Jewish. Perhaps the feeling is genetic, or maybe my grandparents chose me to sustain our Jewish identity. My mother's maiden name, my grandfather's name, is Ziemski. Ziemia means ground or earth. The maiden name of my grandmother is Krychowiecka. Krychowiec is a town in then Polish Ukraine. Both those names may be as much Polish as Jewish. In the 20s and earlier, many patriotic modern Jews who wanted to be part of Polish society changed their names to ones that sounded like shtetls and cities in Poland. For example, one well-known Polish Jewish author was Strykowski. One Polish activist was Stryjeński. I don't know if he was Jewish. Stryj, or Stryj, was a town near the estate in Ukraine, Galicia, that my grandmother is from. I was told grandma's family was resettled by Soviets from Ukraine to Kazakhstan. I am now slowly working to reconstruct the puzzle of my family's history based on little bits of information gathered from my mother and others. I hope to write a book about it someday. My grandfather, who lived in Warsaw before the war, survived the Holocaust because the Nazis sent him to work in a mine in Belgium. I met a cousin of my mother who came from Kazakhstan and stayed for a few hours. And there was Mom's other cousin who was a very troubled person, and another one who never told his wife that he was Jewish. I know nothing about my grandfather's family, only that he was born in Warsaw, like my mother, her sister and brother, like me, and my younger daughter Sarah. I have two daughters, now grown up, living in Warsaw. My mother was angry that I told them they were Jewish when they were small. She believed it would mess up their lives. My daughter thinks that I'm a little crazy for being so interested in Judaism. The older one, who is trying to make her way as a lawyer, finds excuses not to mention to anyone that she is Jewish. They both identify as Jewish privately. And the younger one seems to be a little bit more open to Judaism. It is difficult to say how much anti-Semitism still exists in Poland. Whatever there is, we all grew up with it and are used to it. And there are many Poles who act as friends to the Jews and help to preserve our culture, including a non-Jewish friend of mine who studied Yiddish, works at the Jewish Historical Institute, and travels around Poland to teach Jewish history and culture. But when she came to the US to study Yiddish, she would not tell people she was Polish, because people here expected her to be anti-Semitic if she was Polish. Very recently in Poland, there started to be more open to anti-Semitism, unfortunately. And I would say it's a new phenomenon. I suppose some people would say it's a recurrent phenomenon. We somehow got unused to it for the last 20 years when we could be openly Jewish, and many people nowadays, many Polish people nowadays, are very uncomfortable with it. Well-versed Polish intellectuals are also rather ashamed. People who suspect they may be Jewish or have Jewish roots will again become scared to come out. And the ones who are openly Jewish will be and are already scared and angry. I'm right now studying at the Jewish Theological Seminary to become a cantor. When I finish my studies in a little over a year, I'm not sure what I will do. As there is only 2 non-Orthodox synagogues in Poland, and they don't have any money to pay the cantor. To close, I would like to sing you a song that has tremendous personal meaning for me. The song is called Warszawa ma, my Warsaw. I first saw the film containing this song when I was perhaps 5 years old. This film was shown on TV quite often in the 60s and 70s in September and October or in May to commemorate the Second World War or the Warsaw Uprising. I remember crying every time I saw that scene. As I have already said, I am at least a 3rd generation Jewish Warszawian from my grandfather's side. I love my city, the city with a broken heart, as I have been calling it for many years. Her heart was turned into a ghetto and ripped apart by dynamite. Not many people who were real Warsawians used to visit those parts of Warsaw for a very long time. If they did not find their house standing, they settled in other parts of the city. Not many new buildings were built there for a long time, just some factories. I still feel screams in the courtyards when I visit these parts of Warsaw. The old buildings from both sides of the ghetto walls, still waiting for the rightful owners, dilapidated, decaying for decades. The song that I'm going to sing you expresses my longing and love for Warsaw that was, but will never be the same. For Warsaw that loved and hated the Jews, who in turn loved her for centuries, coming and going between the 2 sides of the Vistula River whenever they were chased away or invited back. The film Zakazane Piosenki, Forbidden Songs, shows Warsaw as it was during the war. Many good Polish people sharing their meager food rations with the begging ghetto children. A once affluent Jew hiding in his apartment, fed by his Polish neighbors, right under the nose of a Volksdeutsch woman, later spotted by a navy blue policeman when he was trying to inconspicuously throw money to a little ghetto girl and knocked over a flower pot. I mean, the Jewish, not the policeman. The song and those pictures have been and shall remain within me, always. As shall the fact that it is sung to a well-known melody of my shtetl bells, Bełżec. Melody expressing a longing for another little town that was and is no more. Warszawo ma, o Warszawo ma, wciąż płaczę, gdy Ciebie zobaczę, Warszawo, Warszawo ma. Tam w getcie głód i nędza i chłód, lecz gorsza od głodu i chłodu tęsknota Warszawo ma. Przez mur przekradam się i biegnę tu jak zgoniony pies, choć tropi mnie pan władza, żandarm, gestapo i SS. Warszawo ma. Patrz wokół me łza, bo nie wiem, czy jeszcze zobaczę Cię jutro. Warszawo ma. more so, though, there's a tear in my eye, because I don't know if I still will see you tomorrow, my Warsaw.
Thank you, Anna, for that beautiful memory that should stir all of us. Tonight you heard about memory, suppression, and remembrance. And tonight we also pause as I'm going to a memorial service in a few minutes for the 6 million who perished or murdered in the Shoah. Before we do that, let me just tell you that there is an exhibit at the back of the room which you're welcome to look at. Please take these books home, because not only are they a program book, but they have references to material on the internet and publications that expand on what you heard tonight. You also have an opportunity in the back of the room to light a memorial candle. If you had your Jewish European ancestry, you can be certain that you are lighting a memorial candle for somebody in your own family. In a few moments, we will start the memorial service with the traditional candle lighting in memory of the 6 million.
Please turn in your booklets to page 12. Please join me at the bottom paragraph in the English on page 12. Exalted, passionate God, grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure, the souls of all our brethren, men, women, and children of the house of Israel, who were slaughtered and burned.
מלא רחמים, שוכן במרמים, אמצא מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה. במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזכירים את נשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל, אנשים נשים וטף, שנהרגו בשואה. וגן עדן תהא מנוחתם, ענה בעל הרחמים, הסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים. וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני ונחלתם, ינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם. ונאמר
Please join me responsively on page 13. A song of ascent. I lift up my eyes to the hills. What is the source of my help?
My help comes from the Lord, maker of the heavens and the earth.
He will not allow you to stumble. Your guardian will not slumber.
Indeed, the guardian of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps.
The Lord is your guardian, your shelter at your side.
The sun will not smite you by day, nor the moon by night.
The Lord will guard you against all evil. He will guard you, body and soul.
The Lord will guard your going out and your coming home, now and forever.
We rise for the recitation of the mourner's Kaddish on page 14. Yikadal, Yikadash, Shmei Rabbav, Ve'alma Divrach Yerutei, Ve'amrit Malchutei, V'chayechon, V'yomechon, V'chayei Nechol Beit Yisrael, V'agala V'izman Kariv, V'imru Amen, Yehei Shmei Rabbav V'orach, Ve'alam, V'amel Maya, Yisparach, V'yishtabach, V'yipar, V'yitromam, V'yitnaseh, V'yitadar, V'yitalel, V'yitalam, Shmei Kudsha, B'rechu, V'nela, V'yikol, V'yirchata, V'shirata, V'tushmachata, V'nechmata, V'rab V'yalma, V'yimru, Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba V'yishmaya, V'chaim Aleinu, V'yal Kol Yisrael, V'yimru, Amen. Say Shalom, V'yimruha, V'yaseh Shalom, Aleinu, V'yal Kol Yisrael, Turn to the Ani Ma'amid on page 16.
Amin, 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 amin,
You also want to recognize at this time our town supervisor, Ron Gilbert, is with us. We appreciate that, as well as Councilman Patel, who is here. Stuart, I'm going to let everyone out from. We thank you for attending.
Himmel bleiben, verstellen neue Tag. Warum wird noch unser ausgewählte Show? Es wird der Point und unser Tracht, wir seien da. Warum wird noch unser ausgewählte Show? Es wird der Point und unser Tracht, wir seien da. Von grünen Palmen mit weißen Mandeln stehen, wir kommen unser Heim mit unser Werk. Und wo wir fallen, sie zerspritzt und unser Blut. Strotzen wird noch unser Blut, unser Blut. Und wo wir fallen, sie zerspritzt und unser Blut. Strotzen wird noch unser Blut, unser Blut. Wir sind da.
I want to thank the choral group and our committee who really were the ones to put this program together. And I want to thank all of you for participating, because you are the ones who are preserving the memory. Feel free to go back, chat,